This was Joel Embiid after Game 6.
Oh, no. I think he broke my face. I'm serious. Yeah, I think he might have broken my face, but it's all good. It's the playoffs.
Well, turns out he was right. That elbow from Siakam fractured an orbital bone in Embiid's face. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and in this video, we're going to address the honestly shocking news that Joel Embiid now has an orbital fracture and is out indefinitely. I 100% agree with everybody wondering what in the world Embiid was doing in the game up by this much at the end of the fourth quarter. But this was the play, of course. Siakam driving into the basket, sweeps those arms across, and his left elbow basically hits Embiid square above that right eye. Now, this is almost more force and more violent than what we would see with like a boxing injury or mixed martial arts. Because with boxing or MMA, there's some padding there. Here with Siakam, basically one of the hardest bony spots in his body, kind of the olecranon or the back of his ulna in the forearm, where there's really no padding underneath the skin before you get to the bone, hits Embiid directly around the eye, resulting in a fracture of his orbit. In Embiid's post-game interview, he actually said he thought his face was broken, and he was right. Here we can see Embiid has obvious swelling over that right side of the face. Now, he had a little bit of an abrasion, so a little bit of a cut, so presumably most of the impact from Siakam's elbow would have been more in this sort of superior portion or the upper portion of the eye. You can see his eyelid has some swelling. It's a little bit more closed compared to the left side, and maybe even a little bit of swelling down lower around his eye. One nice thing that we'll get to in a little bit is Embiid's eyes seem to be moving together. He seems to have good conjugate gaze, meaning it doesn't seem like at least he has any impingement of his eye muscles because his eyes are all moving at the same time in synchronicity with one another, which is important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Next, we'll look at the anatomy and talk about some return to play data, but first I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of today's video. Today's video is sponsored by Let's Get Checked, a leader in home health testing kits for a wide variety of medical lab tests. Let's Get Checked is working to improve healthcare access by providing reliable home testing kits for things like men's and women's health and general wellness like cholesterol and thyroid tests. One of their offerings is male hormone testing, something that might be of particular interest for a lot of my audience. A study in the mid-2000s found that average levels of testosterone are dropping by around 1% a year since the 1980s. Low testosterone can cause a number of side effects like decreased muscle mass, fatigue, or lower drive. If you want to check your T levels from the convenience and privacy of your own home, then Let's Get Checked is a perfect option for you. Your home testing kit is delivered in discreet packaging with next day delivery. There's simple instructions for obtaining your sample at home and everything you need to ship it back safely and securely. Once your sample arrives, results are available in 2 to 5 days and are reviewed by a clinician. If you have any questions, you can always contact their healthcare staff, and they'll also be happy to send your results to your own healthcare provider. So if you want to check your hormone levels from the comfort of your home, then click the link in the description below and use code Dr. Brian to get 30% off your test. That's DRBRIAN for 30% off your test. Thank you again to Let's Get Checked for sponsoring today's video, and let's get back to our learning. Looking at our biodigital anatomy tool here, let's talk about orbital fractures. So first thing to know, there's not just one orbital bone. The same way that we have like a humerus or an arm bone, the orbital bone is really a collection of bones that come together to form the orbital socket. Here we've got, of course, the eyeball or the orbit within each of those orbital sockets. And if we get rid of some of these structures, what we can ultimately see is going to be all those individual components of the orbit. So if we look here on the right side, I'm going to individually go through and paint some of these to see them. So the first one that we get to here is going to be the frontal bone. That's what kind of forms the upper portion, that hard area just beneath your eyebrow. This is kind of the area where it looks like Embiid had that laceration. As we continue to work our way around, we're going to get into the bone on the outside here, and this is going to be a bone called the zygomatic bone. That's really what forms kind of your cheekbone prominence or your malar prominence. The majority of that is going to be this zygomatic bone. This is typically where we see boxers get punched when we have orbital fractures. Continuing around here, the floor of the orbit or the lower portion is going to be the maxilla. This is what kind of compromises your upper jaw. And then as we move deeper into the back of the eye, we're going to have multiple bones kind of around more of the nasal side. These, of course, are going to include the ethmoid bone here on the inside. We're going to have the lacrimal bone here, and then on the far back outer portion, the sphenoid bone. So all of these bones technically are considered part of the orbit, and a fracture in any of those bones could be considered an orbital fracture. One of the big reasons I mentioned Embiid's eye movements is because of the proximity of all the muscles that control the eye. So here on the left side, I've got all those different little muscles highlighted. And basically every time you look in one direction, there's actually a muscle that's pulling your eye to allow you to look in that direction. It's most common, we commonly see fractures in the orbital floor, meaning this lower portion of the socket. And so when that's the case, a muscle called the inferior rectus that controls movement of the eye downward can sometimes get pinched in a fragment of that fracture. To check for this, we have athletes look upwards. If you're not able to look upwards because that inferior rectus is being tethered down, that's one of the signs of an orbital fracture. So it's really not so much the bones that we worry about here as it is injury to the surrounding structures, the extraocular muscles, and the eyeball itself. The NBA data from Jeff Stotts, go follow him at InStreetClothes, tells us that the time lost in season is around 10 games, which is a lot shorter than it might sound after somebody has something so bad like an orbital fracture. Embiid himself, of course, had an orbital fracture, I believe, on the other side a number of years ago and missed around 3 weeks, I think. He had surgery for the fracture and then returned with that protective eye shield. With this injury for Embiid, there's no guarantee that he's going to need surgery. A lot of it depends on waiting for the swelling to come down to really be able to fully appreciate the extent of the fracture. If the fracture is minimal, then they're not going to risk the complications of a surgery of going in there to try and put a plate across it. But if it's significant enough, then certainly they will. Assuming Embiid has no injury to his eyeball or the muscles around his eye, there's no reason to fear that this would be like a playoff-ending injury. Now, we're certainly getting close when we talk about that kind of 10-game, 2 to 3 week mark, but this isn't like an ACL tear where we say somebody's automatically ruled out. There's a chance that Embiid could come back, but I would be very surprised to see him back during round 2, maybe even during the Eastern Conference Finals. But this is like his vision that we're worried about for the rest of his life, and so this isn't something that we're going to play around with, like you might take the risk of having a hamstring injury re-strain. This is his vision, and so they're going to take it a lot more seriously than just your average run-of-the-mill sports injury. So nonetheless, an absolutely surprising bit of news to hear about Joel Embiid. Of course, this will hopefully give some time for his thumb to calm down and maybe be a little bit less painful if he is able to return. I would be absolutely stunned to see Embiid back here in round 2, but if they get to the Eastern Conference Finals and certainly the finals, I think there's a chance we could see him back, but probably still wearing a protective mask. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know, as always, any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later.